Now, as we mentioned earlier on in the show, Uber has rolled out a fleet of wholly electric motorcycles for urban commuters here in Kenya. Now, starting with an initial fleet of 100 whisper-quiet battery-powered motorcycles, the firm now aims to scale up to at least 3,000 units in the Kenyan capital of Nairobi by February 2024. Now, given their limited fuel consumption and high affordability, motorcycles are a key mode of transport in many sub-Saharan African economies. They move people and goods within cities. Kenya, for example, imported almost 120,000 motorcycles in the year to February. Now, Uber and its fleet partner, Green Wheels, expect that electric offering will cut drivers' costs by about 30% to 35% rather, while offering passengers a fare reduction of 15% to 20%, and that's compared to journeys on petrol-powered motorcycles. Well, CGTN's Ramanyang spoke to Kagiso Khaole, Uber's general manager for sub-Saharan Africa, ahead of that launch. And he started their conversation by asking him how the support infrastructure for these electric two-wheelers was set up.
In terms of the charging itself, it's not your traditional plug in and wait. These are swapping stations. So the driver will be able to go in, quickly swap out their battery, swap in the new one, and continue on their journey. So what we're looking to do is to initially launch in a small area within the city and continue expanding as more and more vehicles come into the market.
So which part of the city are you starting with initially?
Well, so starting with some key areas around Westlands and the like. Some of those suburbs that we've been looking at is where we're currently finding a lot of frequent travel, and slowly there's 6 areas that we're looking at, and we'll keep expanding onto the outskirts going forward. But we're starting with the center and starting to expand to the edges of the city over time.
So you're starting with, you mentioned you have a partner who's handling, the logistics side of it, getting the bike, sourcing the bike, setting up the swap stations. But beyond that, is this partner going to set up these charge stations, or rather swap stations, alongside fossil fuel stations as well? Your typical petrol stations, because on paper they would seem to be the ideal place, to set up that sort of infrastructure.
Yes, and that does make sense. We also, your auto gas stations, there'll be swapping stations there. We're looking at other locations as well, based again on the demand and how the trips and movement of people operate. Over time, we do see these living together, right? We'll see a transition. You've already seen it in terms of some of the big oil companies. They are having electrification side by side with traditional fossil fuels. But the key thing here is about convenience and accessibility. As a driver on a motorbike, I want to be certain that, wherever I'm taking the customer, I can be able to find a swap station if there's a need to. So we're leveraging our technology to ensure, there's things like limitations on how far you can go out as well. Again, just to make sure that the ride experience is protected at all times.
What about cost? Because, it's fantastic that we're doing all these lovely things, right, to try and remove carbon emissions from the equation. But for the typical consumer, their argument will be, especially, for a lot of these economies, how disposable income has been shrinking for the last couple of years. They're dealing with inflation. Their currency value has also been falling a fair bit. So for them, if it doesn't make sense on a price level, they don't care. So how does this compare? And the cost of a ride on an electric motor vis-a-vis the cost of a ride on a conventional internal petrol-powered motorcycle?
And this is an example of African solutions for African problems. And one of the challenges is that we've seen what's happening in the macroeconomic environment. There's pressure on the rider side, pressure on the driver side, and us as a market maker is how do we balance those interests? We've got rising fuel costs, and again, household inflation. We've seen what's happened to the currency as well, and we needed to structurally create new products that cater for both. So with the electric Boda product that we have, it will actually be able to bring more income to the driver while maintaining fares for the rider. So it's actually cheaper to operate an electric motorbike than it is to operate an ICE vehicle. So these internal combustion bikes, over time, I believe that they'll start phasing out from the market. You'll start seeing more and more of these electric bikes because they just make sense, and they make sense for this current economic environment. And we took it upon ourselves to say, as Uber, how do we bring this to the city. How do we bring it to the city at scale, which is also important. To make the change has to happen at scale. And that's why, from tomorrow, there's over 100 bikes. They'll start coming in. We're hoping to scale up very quickly to about 3,000 within the next 6 months or so.
What about the cost of acquisitions of these machines? Because, if you look at the macro environment in Kenya, and it's arguably the same in Nigeria and in South Africa as well. Central banks have been raising rates, right, fairly gradually over the years. Cost of credit has become a big concern in a lot of these markets. So that being the case, is Uber doing anything to help riders acquire the riders who might be interested in saying, I'd like to try an electric boda boda. Are you providing any help with credit facilities?
Yeah, so we are exploring other models as well to create access, such as drive to own. And the benefit of us working with Kenyan companies and partners is that we're able to finance these vehicles at a much lower cost than the average Kenyan can. We've heard of exorbitant amounts that people have to pay to rent their bikes. But now working through a fleet partner is that we're able to then acquire at scale, which brings the cost lower and makes it more accessible to the ordinary individual.
So can you share any numbers on that? What sort of interest rates are we talking about, acquisition costs? Because a typical bike in the market would be $1,000, $1,500. So you'd essentially have to be competitive against that.
So for this particular launch, we are the fleet partner is actually putting their capital up front for it. So it's going to come. It's not at any cost to the driver itself. But in future, we are going to be looking at that. So, again, once you scale, you're able to access capital markets, single-digit interest rates, which is very difficult to get, in many markets across Africa.